Hello and welcome to podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. When you're ready to launch your next app or want to try a project you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so check out our friends over at Linode. With their managed Kubernetes platform, it's easy to get started with the next generation of deployment and scaling, powered by the battle-tested Linode platform, including simple pricing, node balancers, 40 gigabit networking, and dedicated CPU and GPU instances. And now you can launch a managed MySQL, Postgres, or Mongo database cluster in minutes to keep your critical data safe with automated backups and failover. Go to pythonpodcast.com/linode today to get a $100 credit to try out their new database service, and don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. Your host, as usual, is Tobias Macey, and today I'm interviewing Bruno Rocha about Dynaconf, a powerful and flexible framework for managing your application's configuration settings. So, Bruno, can you start by introducing yourself?
Hi, thanks for inviting me for this podcast. My name is Bruno Rocha. I live in Portugal. Some things about me. I'm a member of the Python Software Foundation. I'm a senior engineer on Red Hat Ansible. I have a YouTube and a Twitch stream channel targeting mostly Portuguese-speaking audience where I talk about Python and programming. And besides that, I like bicycles. That's all about me.
And do you remember how you first got introduced to Python?
Oh, yeah, let me remind this. It was around 2003. I worked in a factory, and my job was maintenance of hundreds of Linux desktops. And we use a Linux distribution called Kurumin Linux, which is a Brazilian Linux distribution. And one of the features of that Linux was called Magic Icons. So it was like a GUI application with buttons where user can click and run bash scripts or things to automate Linux stuff. And then I written those scripts in bash and Perl for a long time and adding more day-to-day Office activities to those icons, like merging files, printing, and doing all the Office day-to-day job using Perl, basically. But at some point, I started contributing. I think that was actually my first open source project that I was a contributor. And when I started contributing back to the Magic Icon system on Kurumin Linux, I found that they were moving from Perl to Python. And then I had to learn Python to rewrite those scripts, that distribution. Today, that distribution is no more maintained, but that was a good experience, and that's why I first learned Python. And from that point, I stopped using Perl and kept using Python for everything. Yeah.
That brings us to now the topic at hand, which is the Dynaconf project. I'm curious if you can share a bit about what it is and some of the story behind how it got started and why you decided to build this project.
Well, so yeah, Dynaconf is a library that I like to define it as a settings client. So settings usually are defined in multiple locations, like static files. You can have a PY file, TOML, YAML, JSON, or any of the other common formats usually you do for application settings. The settings is overridable by environment variables and even by external servers like in-memory database or secrets vault. And then at some point, you need to gather all those information in a single object. And this object is Dynaconf. I like to think it as a settings client that I can configure and point to multiple sources. And then it gives us a single settings object, a single Python object where you can access and deal with those settings objects. So that is basically Dynaconf, and if I can explain it simply, it's a library to access settings. Whatever the settings are located, Dynaconf brings you a bridge for you to access and get those settings together. And the other question was the story behind it. So I worked in a company that was running Django and Flask application on the cloud on AWS. It was 2014. And the main website and API, they used load balance and auto scaling. So eventually, there were hundreds of EC2 instances running on the cloud. And they wanted to be able to share the same settings with all those instances that were running. So you can think like applications will start having on the environment or hard-coded settings like in a constant file. But what they wanted in that project is to have a single place where the settings is stored, like in S3 or any other shared file system, and all the instance could read from the same place the settings. So this was like the first mission we did. And then the second thing that we did in the project was like turning the settings dynamic. So for that time, we used a Redis instance, and Redis stored key values, and then all the instances read key values from the Redis instance inside the AWS network. So that's how the library started. So I just went to the main project and I created a folder called dynamic config. And then I started like coding using Python dynamic features like overriding get attribute, trying to do like lazy evaluation. And then I ended up with something really nice, which we were able to use it to read files locally. If it was not found locally, it would fall back to this to the environment and then to external services. So we decided to like promote it to a package. And then instead of dynamic config, we shorted a little bit to Dynaconf and created a package. It started being used by all the projects, all the internal projects on that company. So it was 2014. Heroku released a guide called 12 Factor Apps. And 12 Factor Apps was like our main drive for deciding how the library would be written. Because after this first version, we did many refactorings and we based it a lot on 12 Factor guide. The third topic on the 12 Factor is the config, and that says that configuration must belong to environment. And then we started like coding Dynaconf to be like environment first. And from that point, we added many other features, but that's how it started. It started like just as a Python model inside a big monolithic project, dynamic config, and I remember that we pulled that off that project and created the Dynaconf. And yeah, now it grew like it's no more like a single small library. It's more like you said on the beginning of the show, it's a framework for managing settings together with this settings client. So yeah, that's a little bit of the history.
Are there any particular goals or kind of design philosophies or strong opinions about how to manage settings that you have for Dynaconf?
The fact is that the project is evolving organically. So it's based on the needs and feedback of the users and contributors. So we are constantly adding new things and fixing things based on that. So we don't have like a really strict guideline on the style that we are following. I can say that the goal as a project is to be reliable and simple to use. So I also see that I want Dynaconf to be a go-to choice when you think about how to manage settings on your Python application. I already see that on the companies and communities where I participate because I try to influence people sometimes to use the library and they say, yeah, we need to deal with settings. So it's going to be like, just put Dynaconf here. And to be able to be like a go-to choice and simple, you have to be very like frictionless. So the project should be something you can plug into your project and you can unplug from your project easily. So I think this is a thing that we try to keep on Dynaconf. You can take your project right now, add Dynaconf, and it works. And if you need or if you don't like Dynaconf anymore, you can just remove it. And it's not going to be a hard work because the way Dynaconf is implemented.
As far as the kind of types or categories of projects that you have in mind as you build and iterate on Dynaconf, are there any particular ecosystems or use cases that you are more focused on or that tend to work better with Dynaconf?
Yeah, definitely. I think web applications running on cloud is the main target. So as we base it on 12 factor app, I think whenever you have environment and you have this environment varying across multiple deployments, I think Dynaconf is a very good fit for it. So it can be running on virtual machine, containers, Kubernetes, everything about the 12 factor apps, which is like aimed for SaaS applications. I think it's a perfect fit for Dynaconf. But we have users using Dynaconf for other projects. So we have people and contributors running for machine learning pipelines. So they configure all the models using Dynaconf, loading of Dynaconf files. We have CLI applications that people create, and then the end user of the CLI application like puts a settings file together in the folder they are running the CLI, and Dynaconf loads the local settings. We have desktop applications and testing frameworks. So the first focus was cloud applications, but users starts to be like more creative and using it whatever you imagine. So I think Dynaconf can fit on many cases, but the main target is when we are looking to like change things, when we are looking to add new functionalities, we always think about the cloud first. Yeah.
As far as the category of settings management for applications, it's one of those things that is seemingly very simple, but is deceptively complex as you dig deeper into the problem space, where at the outset, it's just, I just need a file that says to, set these different values, as you were describing, move into different environments, or you need to be able to support different runtimes or kind of application structures. You start to realize, now I need to be able to pull things from multiple places. I need to be able to manage things like overrides, or, how do I manage secrets? And I'm wondering, what are some of the kind of general philosophies that you've encountered about the so-called quote unquote right way to do it, and some of the ways that you think about what philosophies are best suited for applications that you're trying to kind of encode into how Dynaconf is able to manage some of those things like overlays and environment-specific attributes and secrets, etc.
I think that settings is like an accessory for your application. It's not the main focus of any application. So your application should focus on the things it should resolve. And as less you see the settings, the best, because it will be like transparent and it's not like being on your way from you and your code. So I think one of most complex thing to do when you are creating your own settings management is trying to do this in a more like frictionless way, transparent way. I see lots of settings objects where you just to read a single variable, you need to call methods like get, read, parse, and you need to do your own specific typecasting on every place. And then when you look to the code, you have more like interaction with the settings than other things. So I think what I learned that is if you do that, you are like coupling your code with your settings library. And the main philosophy for Dynaconf is to be like decoupled. We want Dynaconf to be decoupled and transparent from the project. The Dynaconf API behaves like a normal Python module or a dict-like object, because a Python module with attribute access or a dict-like object, when you look up by keys, is the two ways people read settings. If you have a constant file, it's going to be attribute. If you have a JSON, dictionaries like after parsing. So Dynaconf supports both APIs, and you can like treat Dynaconf just as normal Python object. You don't have any kind of special that you need to call or need to prepare your application. You just use as normal Python variables. I think this is important because, as I said, at any point in time, you might need to change your settings manager. Even if you have your own written settings manager, you might want to migrate to Dynaconf. And if your settings are really agnostic, like simple Python objects, it's going to be easy to plug Dynaconf in your project. And the same way, the other way, like if you want to remove Dynaconf, it's just like removing the object created by Dynaconf, replacing to another object that behaves like a Python object, and everything works. So I think this is important to decouple the settings from the project. So there are challenges that you're gonna be dealing with settings, like if you want like dynamic features like lazy evaluation and overload access from the settings, like you want to put middlewares between who is accessing your settings and where the settings is, doing transformations. So this is going to be easier if you do this in a transparent way, because Python offers lots of features for dynamic programming. You can override, you can do lazy evaluation, you can override attribute access. So it's not that difficult to use Python to create a layer of abstraction for assessing. We see that with ORMs for databases, and Dynaconf try to fit that for the settings. So yeah. And about the right way, what would be like the right way to treat the settings? I still stick with the 12 factor apps. I think settings belongs to environment. So the application must have reasonable defaults. It should be able to run without any specific setting. Application could have like required settings, but it should be able to run with minimal settings. But everything should be like belonging to the environment where application is running. So the code is actually not. I think it's true for cloud applications because you can run in multiple cloud providers. It's true for CLI applications if you distribute it to multiple targets and multiple ways of running. So yeah, I think that's what I have to say.
One of the things that you noted in there was the question of being able to cast the different values into their appropriate types. And with Python being a dynamic language and also the, I guess, not necessarily evenly distributed adoption of type annotations, et cetera, that is an interesting question for being able to manage settings in Python applications. And what you were saying about things like parse bool, parse int, I've definitely seen that all over the place, both in widely used libraries as well as in some of the libraries that I've seen some of my teams kind of build in-house. And I'm interested in understanding your thoughts on kind of how to encode some of that type information in the settings that you're loading for your application, as far as like what type should it be, and then particularly in the case where maybe it's a string, but it should only be one of a particular set. So you maybe want to have an enum, and just being able to understand like what are the possible range of valid settings for this attribute, and then being able to bring in things like annotations or documentation around the purpose for a given setting, so that as you come into a brand new project and it has the settings defined, you can say, okay, I understand what this value is supposed to do and why.
About typing, in the first version of Dynaconf, we decided to be transparent and frictionless. I love this word, like frictionless, like you just do settings.key and you fetch the value you want. And with the type, it's defined by Dynaconf. So we wanted to avoid the need for you to call settings.key.cast or settings.get, and then you put a key and then type that you want that to be casted. So we want to avoid this extra work and give you the final data to use. So the first approach, which is already supported today, but it's not highly used, we added type annotations to the variable itself. So as it's based on the environment variable, and environment variables as our first source of truth on an application environment, you can only export strings. And Python reads all environment variables as strings. So what we did, we created some tokens, some markers. It has nothing to do with type annotations. It's just you put at JSON, and then you can put a JSON string and export it to your environment. You can put like at int, at string, at boolean. All the basic types are, we have a marker. So when you are exporting environment variable, you mark and then space and the actual value you want to be parsed. So the type is on the source, is on the data itself, and Dynaconf parses based on that. So this was the first implementation. As I said, it works. You can actually add your own transformations. So you can create your own markers, and then you put this, your own annotation. Like you have like a parser for a phone number or email address. You can mark this as an email, and then Dynaconf will try to parse this and include and give you back when you access like a structure, an object, a class, anything you want. So it's very customizable. We call it converters inside the source code. But then when we released Dynaconf 3.0, we figured out that most of the users were migrating to TOML, Tom Obvious Minimal Language, which is used today on many projects like PyProject.toml, Rust uses on Cargo.toml. We see this being adopted like as a very standard on application configuration. So we decided to adopt Toml as our default parser. So that makes things like easier because you can export a variable as a string, and then we pass this when reading to the Toml parser. And if it's a valid Toml integer, Dynaconf reads as an integer. If it's a valid Toml float, it reads as a float. So you can obviously replace this behavior. You can choose your Dynaconf to use YAML as a parser, to use JSON as a parser, but the default one is Toml. So you can just export, like if it looks like a string, Dynaconf will infer it's a string. So there is a type inference based on environment variables. When you are working with files that has typing, for example, YAML has its own typing, Toml, JSON, then Dynaconf respects the typing coming from the source. Yeah. But for all the other string-based sources, typing will be inferred unless you annotate it explicitly.
As I was mentioning earlier, basically every engineer who writes an application gets to the point where they say, oh, I need to be able to change this setting. And so they start to implement their own settings management system. Oftentimes it's very basic, but as you evolve the project and iterate on it, your settings management becomes increasingly complicated. And I'm wondering, what are some of the, anti-patterns that you see people develop as they build their own homegrown systems for addressing settings in their applications, and some of the ways that it can lead to unmaintainable code and overly complex settings management approaches or overly rigid or opinionated ways of being able to specify those values?
Dealing with multiple sources of data is difficult, especially if you have layered environments. For example, you have a special section for testing variables, production, development, and this varies across all the environments you are going to be deploying. So when you get all those data together, there is a very hard decision to make. So let's say you read like 2 static files like Toml or YAML, and you read multiple prefixed environment variables. And now you have a lot of data coming from different sources. How do you merge it? How do you, if you have the same key on the settings file and the same key is overridden by an environment variable, and this is not just a simple primitive type like an integer or a string, it's a data structure. So this happens a lot on Django projects, for example. You have like a key called databases, which is a dictionary, and inside databases you have like nested keys. And then the user wants to override only the password, not the whole dictionary for that key. So how do you do that? So I see that in many cases, you will be requiring the user to override the whole dictionary, but we ended up adding a way for you to override only the nested keys. So you can traverse using the variable names to the nested structures and then merge data. But when we are talking about more complex data structures like lists, and let's say you have a list of middlewares that your application will use, and you want to contribute with another middleware, how do you decide if it's going to be on the first item of the list, last item of the list? How do you ensure it's not duplicating? Like if you add the middleware twice, maybe you are adding overhead in our application. So those decisions are really hard because there are multiple opinions on it. So there are people that think it should be more strict. Like if you want to override something, you need to override the entire object. We wanted to add more flexibility. So there are multiple merging strategies that we offer on Dynaconf. So when you are building your variable or your dictionary, you can mark it with some special keys or markers, and this will tell Dynaconf what is the merging strategy for that. So what I see when people start doing in-house settings management is that they don't think about it at the first time. And then when the application starts growing, having multiple environments, they start needing data merging in multiple environments. And it becomes a challenge, especially if you have already running environments that you don't want to change a lot. So that's one of the things. Another thing is that based on Unix philosophy, I think environment variables first. Yeah, so you should always look to environment variables. We offer ways to define specific subset of environment variables you want to be overridable, but based on the subset of environment variables you have, this should be the source of truth on your application.
And so, digging into Dynaconf itself, can you describe a bit about some of the implementation details and some of the ways that you designed the project to be able to make it sustainable and maintainable, and some of the evolution that it has gone through from when you first started building it as a one-off solution to a specific application to where it is now, where it is this generalized framework for settings management?
Yeah, so I think the first important thing on this topic is tests. So from the time we decided to promote Dynaconf to a package, we decided that 100% of test coverage will be the target. So we have 100% of unit testing. I know that unit testing is not enough for all the dynamic cases. So that's why we also have functional tests, which are growing. For every issue, we add more functional tests. So tests is like helping a lot for keeping the library reliable, yeah, because it's really important. And yeah, in terms of implementation, Dynaconf is just a class, like it's a Python class, and it's implemented using lazy evaluation. So there's a functional module inside Dynaconf. In this functional, we created some types that has lazy evaluation. So the user declare configuration, for example, paths, validators, all the kinds of preferences they want when instantiate the settings object from Dynaconf. And at that point, nothing is really performed by Dynaconf. Dynaconf just creates a class with a bunch of data in it, the declaration of how we want Dynaconf to be behaving. And then you can like start your application without need to like have all the Dynaconf process. So you don't block the import time of your application because of settings. This is also another thing I see people doing. Like when you have a settings library that during import time, you need to load all the files and do all the transformations, then you can block your application startup time just to read some settings files that is going to be used only later. So that's why we implemented this as a lazy evaluation class. When the first variable is assessed in Dynaconf in your application lifetime, then Dynaconf starts building its loaders. So it works with a pool of loaders, and you can add more loaders to it. It has a collection of loaders that are built in. For example, it has a JSON loader, .ini loader, TOML loader, YAML loader, environment variable loader. So those are included in a pool in a specific order. All of this is configurable, and you can easily create your own loader and plug there. And loaders uses the strategy pattern, where you can take the base loader and then you pass your file reader, your file writer, and the loader methods that will be returning data. So after the data is loaded, it's just a Python dictionary that's coming from all the different sources. So you see, this makes it flexible because on the loader, you can read from a database. For example, we have cases where people wrote a loader for MySQL. They go and do a select in MySQL, get some key pairs from MySQL, build a dictionary, and feed Dynaconf with that data. So after every loader runs, we put each dictionary in a chain map. Chain map is a Python object that is a stack of dictionaries. So you chain lots of dictionaries together in a single object. And then when you try to access a key, if the key is found on the first dictionary, the latest inserted, then it's returned. If not, then the chain map is going to be trying all the other dictionaries in order until it do like attribute error or key error. So when Dynaconf does it, it's loading, it puts in a chain map, and then we do all the things we need in the chain map, like merging, parsing, all the transformations are inside the chain map. So the process of loading from source involves parsing. So because, as I said, we can define type annotations. So when you read an environment variable, if it's marked with int, bool, JSON, etc., it should be like casted to the appropriate type. Also, Dynaconf supports some lazy formatting. So you can have, for example, environment variable or a settings variable in a text file with Jinja templating. So people usually use this to calculate how many processors you have in a machine, or to call some external thing and build the settings on the go, or to reuse some environment variable. So this is the process. So this is the heavy process that Dynaconf does. So at the end of the day, when your settings is loaded, what you have is a settings, which is a class using all the dynamic Python features, such as overloading of get attributes and all those methods that makes it easy to get a key and look up that on the chain map that it has. And all of this is very quick because it's all using Python. On the chain map, we have almost constant time to access. So after the loading, everything is very, very simple. So as you see, if you look, the overview of the architecture is not like too much. It's just a simple class. But then we plug the loaders and the strategies user on the loaders. Then we have the filters, and especially we have the validators, so you can ensure that the settings look the way you want. So yeah, that's more or less how it's implemented. And as I said, it growed, evolved, mostly organic. So from that small project, it started becoming like a framework, and people from different backgrounds are contributing and bringing more features from sometimes these features in other settings libraries they bring to Dynaconf. So we have different ways of doing.
Given the fact that it has these interfaces for custom loaders and different strategies, it definitely is very extensible. And I'm wondering how you thought about the process of deciding which strategies, which loaders to incorporate into the Dynaconf project itself as it's packaged and released, and what capabilities you are consciously deciding not to bring into the core because either it's a bespoke solution for one person or it's something that is not a sort of core functionality and you want to kind of push that more into allowing people to do what they need to do without overloading the project and overloading your kind of maintainer capabilities, into some of the ways that people are able to hook into Dynaconf to be able to add those customizations.
When I started, I got very excited about adding more features. It was like my vision. Like, I want Dynaconf to be able to load all the possible configuration formats and all the possible services targeting for configuration, like TCD, Redis, Vault, etc. And then at that point, we added too many features into the library. I know that. So all those loaders that we call the core loaders for multiple file types are not really necessary on all Dynaconf installations. But currently, if you do pip install Dynaconf, you are getting all those together. So at some point, there was no extensive thinking about this. When we released the 3.0, I started having more contributions, and we formed like a board of maintainers, and people started thinking about like, we don't want to add more things here. We need things to be added as a plugin. So now we have like an initial plugin system. So for example, there is a PyTest plugin to make it easier to use Dynaconf for when you are mutating settings during your settings. And we decided to not accept this as a core feature. And then the person that sent the PR created a Dynaconf PyTest repository with a plugin. So it was like 1 year ago or 2 years ago, I don't remember exactly, but we started like rejecting more features to focus on fixing and improving features that we have in the library. And now we want to improve our plugin system. And we have plans to have more plugins in the future, and even removing some features from the core, turning them into plugins. This is one of the things in our roadmap. Yeah. But right now we are not accepting like new features, like new default core loaders. If you want to load something, for example, from a new file format or a new external service, we will suggest you to create, for example, a plugin. There are documentation on how you can use it. And yeah, currently that's our approach, to fix and improve things before we add more features and try to get the library. It's small, it's very small, but we need to get it more small and have only the core on the main repository. Yeah.
And then as far as promoting kind of reusability and collaboration among the kind of ecosystem of people building on top of Dynaconf, do you have any, I guess, naming convention for packages that plug into Dynaconf to add custom functionality, such as if I wanted to add something that allowed for loading key value data from console, for instance, or is there any kind of GitHub organization that you have for being able to allow people to contribute their plugins to Dynaconf so that people can kind of discover all the options that are out there rather than just reinventing the wheel all the time?
Yeah, we have a GitHub organization. It's called Dynaconf, github.com/Dynaconf. There's the website, dynaconf.com, and there, I think the 2 plugins that exists right now is listed somewhere there. And we have the discussions forum on GitHub. So if people want like to contribute with a new loader or new functionality, we discuss there or on our Matrix channel, and we give the help needed to create this plugin. It's not a hard work because you can create a loader by subclassing the base loader and adding those 3 objects, reader, writer, and loader. And also we have now support for hooks. So we got some inspiration from PyTest. So you can file with hooks that Dynaconf will call on certain points of its loading process. So it's possible to like customize lots of things in Dynaconf right now. Yeah, but the main channel is GitHub, github.com/Dynaconf.
You mentioned a bit about the process for kind of onboarding onto Dynaconf as part of your project, where it's largely just pip install and start using it. I'm wondering, what are some of the ways that the implementation and usage of Dynaconf scales with the complexity of a project or the complexity of the environments or kind of support matrix of a given project as it evolves?
The goal for the project is to be really simple. Like you really create your Python settings object. Really, the idea is that it's not going to be something that you need to care a lot in your project. Besides the validators, yeah, which is completely the user responsibility to write, but everything else is really like transparent and outside your project. And yeah, so the usage scale is being very good. I think there are lots of users right now. I don't remember right now, but I think in GitHub we have more than 2,000 repositories that depends on Dynaconf right now. And recently, PyPI marked Dynaconf as a critical project, which I think it means that it's on the top 1% most downloaded libraries. And in terms of support, like we have few contributors that are really active in the GitHub issues. So if you need something, if you have questions, it's really quick to get information. On the Matrix channel, we don't have lots of people because the channel is more like for devs, but it's also a good source of information if you need on implementing Dynaconf in your project. And I would say that GitHub is our main place, and the discussions tab or issues. And usually it's quick. Like I tend to answer questions really fast, and we have other people like helping. So it's scaling good. As for example, the company I work on is like sponsoring me to work on Dynaconf for a certain time on my work. I have like paid time to work on the library. So I'm trying to address lots of issues. So we work with open source, and Dynaconf is one of the libraries in our open source pool. Yeah.
One of the other topics that probably deserves its whole entire episode that we touched on briefly earlier is the question of secrets management, where it's one of the things that, again, sometimes seems like it's straightforward, but can be critical if you get it wrong because it has the potential to expose your application, make it vulnerable to exploit or kind of malfeasance. And I'm wondering, what are some of the ways that you have worked in Dynaconf to be able to strike a balance between that frictionless use case that you're aiming for while providing appropriate guardrails to prevent kind of credential leakage or prevent people kind of circumventing best practice for how to manage sensitive data in their application?
I think the best way to manage secrets today is using encrypted vault services, especially if you are working in the cloud. So you're going to have tooling that will It will depend on the environment you are running. But for example, you have a AWS secret manager, you have HashiCorp Vault, and you can use encrypted environment variables depending on the place you are deploying your application. I think that's the best because you are delegating responsibility for this where the secrets are stored and how it's encrypted to another service that is really good on doing this and well tested for this specifically. And Dynaconf supports out of the box loading data from HashiCorp Vault today. So you can like just pass the configuration, the host, and your token for Vault, and then you can pass, I don't remember exactly, but I think the namespace, and then it goes there and reads your secrets. But you can add loader for other services. It's not hard to do. But this is something that probably you're going to do in a production environment when you have like a team or SRE or DevOps engineer that will provide this service for you as a developer. During your development environment, I think you don't want to have this work of like deploying or running a Vault service during the development. So we decided to make things easier when you're running in development environment. So Dynaconf supports you to add a secrets.toml file. So using the same Dynaconf structure when you are working, you have a settings.toml or .yaml. The format doesn't matter. You can create a file together any settings that is called .secrets and this extension you are using. This is just a settings file, but the first way it helps is that it's added to the git ignore if you use Dynaconf CLI to initialize your project. So you ensure you are not pushing it to your repository. But it's a separate file, so you can ignore it from your project. But you also can encrypt this file if you want. So you can use Dynaconf CLI to add new secrets, and the secrets will be encrypted using a private key. And then your local vault is just a simple file with encrypted data inside it. This is not something that you should use in production system. I know people are using this encrypted secrets file in production. We can't control what users does. So in production, I recommend using an external service, but this is something we provide for making development and testing easier. Another thing that we did is Dynaconf identifies when your settings comes from a secret, and then it will not print it out in logs. It will not print it out in the standard outputs. And when you are using Dynaconf CLI to inspect your environment, it will also just show the part of the secret, not the whole secret. So there's some kind of obfuscation on the variable to make it secure.
As users become more advanced or sophisticated with their use of settings in their application and in their application of Dynaconf, what are some of the kind of advanced or maybe underutilized or overlooked capabilities that are available in the framework?
Yeah, so besides the basic things, I think, as I said, on envvars, you can override, you can traverse to nested keys. That's very powerful, especially if you are working in an existing project. I see lots of Django users that is not using it, but it's very powerful because we adopted the Django way of doing it, which is you export a variable. If it's a dictionary inside your settings, you can use double underscore to go nesting one level in your data structure. And then you can keep using double underscore to traverse to all the other nesting levels. And then you can specifically change that variable you want. And that together with the validation that Dynaconf provides, you can have an easy way to override settings. So this is an underutilized capability that I want to promote more and see people using this better. Other thing is that Dynaconf supports lazy values. You can actually create your own lazy formatter. Right now it has Jinja and it has the math to do like common math expressions like multiplication, division, and so on. So you can export a variable and mark it as a math or a Jinja and put the template or the expression. And then during the load, Dynaconf will evaluate it. It also works together with validation to be more effective. And besides the loaders that we talked, like you can add new loaders to Dynaconf. Now Dynaconf has a hook system. So you can write functions that will be hooked into Dynaconf on specific parts of the loading process. And from the hooks, you return a dictionary, and that dictionary will have declarations that will contribute to the settings. So you can do like data transformation, you can do data validation, you can do all sorts of custom things with this. And I think the thing that is more underutilized in Dynaconf is validators. And it's really important because by default, Dynaconf is schemaless. You just create a settings that equals Dynaconf class instance, and then you start looking for keys inside it. But there is no definition of schema by default. It's very flexible. But we provide a way to define a schema. So you have a validator class where you can provide validator for each key you want, and you can define the type of the key, the range of the key. I think you asked it before, how do you define a range if you have like a number, a port, for example, for a service? So how do you define exactly which options are available there? So you can use the validators to define it. And another good feature of validator is that it has a text field, which is a doc for that settings. So when you define a collection of validators, you put the rules that Dynaconf will validate, and you put the description of this. You can use Dynaconf CLI to generate a documentation for the supported settings for your application. So this is really underutilized. I think that's my fault because I need to promote it more. We are focusing more on the other basic features, but it's very powerful.
And I guess one side topic that I'm interested in personally is another project that I've seen that has some similar capabilities, at least in terms of being able to assign schema and type information to your settings and be able to do some validations at load time, is the Pydantic project. And I'm wondering if you see that as a complementary or an alternative solution for being able to approach settings.
Yeah, so the answer for these questions is on Dynaconf pull request tab. If you go there, you see that there is a pull request that is going to be the Dynaconf 4.0. And on Dynaconf 4.0, we are bringing Pydantic to Dynaconf. So these validators I told you now is we created the validation class. It works very well. We want to keep it working. But what we're going to do is we're going to provide a way for the users to create a schema. You subclass Dynaconf, and then you create a schema, and then use type annotations, and use Pydantic fields, and then Dynaconf will follow Pydantic style of schema. So we see that Python community is moving to this thing called modern Python. All the things are going to this way of programming. So using more data class, more Pydantic with type annotations. So we are moving this way also. It's taking a time because we are not like lots of contributors, but this is in our roadmap for the next version. Yeah.
In your experience of building and using Dynaconf yourself and working with the community of people who are adopting it for their own projects, what are some of the most interesting or innovative or unexpected ways that you've seen it applied?
Oh, that's interesting. I have been hired some months ago by a company to give a consultancy on a project they were using Dynaconf. And it was a very old software. They had like this data collectors, looks like a mobile, but it's like a very factory data collector with software embedded in it. They like scan things, and this generates a .csv file. And at the end of the day, the person collecting the data will select an upload field on the application, select the CSV file or multiple files, and upload to a backend. So they were able to create a new backend using Flask, but they are not able to upgrade these outdated data collectors. So on the application, they have on the client side, they have only a single upload field to send files to the server. And they wanted to gather more information from the client part. So they wanted to have a form with the name, the location, and other information. But it was not possible because I think this is outdated. They can't like update that. So what they did, they added a TOML file in the mobile device with the information they want, like the name of the user and all the serial numbers and things. And then the user, when sending the upload, they select a CSV file and select this TOML file with the information from the local place and upload it to the Flask server. And Flask, instead of parsing this manually, they decided to use Dynaconf for it, which is not like they go for Dynaconf, but work it. Because during upload, they dropped this file in the configuration file. And then when running their pipeline, I think it was an Airflow application, a pipeline, they read settings, and Dynaconf would load that TOML file and know how to process that CSV file. So just to resume this, what they did is instead of creating a new form in the application, they replaced the form with a TOML file. They used Dynaconf to parse it. And Dynaconf is not like a library for doing this. They use Dynaconf as ORM or something to process data coming from requests and not as a settings library. But that was working. They didn't want it to change, so they got a problem where the end users discovered that they can edit the TOML file and override settings that they should not override. And then we ended like creating a custom format, not TOML, and adding a new loader to Dynaconf with more validation to prevent users to hack the system. And it's running with Dynaconf today. So they have lots of collectors. They run multiple pipelines on Airflow, and they use Dynaconf like in an unexpected way. So Dynaconf is their request parsing library. And yeah, I don't think there is any other person or project using like this. And yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting the different ways that the kind of old trope of when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, some of the ways that that manifests.
Yeah, you can control what the user does. We try. Yeah, I learn with this and other projects I work on. We always try to like build fences to prevent users of doing this. But yeah, when you work in a project like this that grows organically, when you find the hole that you need to close, all the users are already using that. So you can't just like remove this feature because everyone relies on the feature. So instead of a bug, you just document and it becomes a feature. And life goes on, yeah, with lots of testing. So yeah, that's interesting.
In your own experience of building Dynaconf and maintaining it and evolving it, what are some of the most interesting or unexpected or challenging lessons that you've learned in the process?
Okay, so, well, interesting. I think when I started doing the project, I thought that more documentation would be better. If I documented everything I did, would be the best thing to do. And that's not the truth. I found out that sometimes more documentation is bad. So the previous documentation of Dynaconf have too many docs. We use it to doc, for example, APIs and function calls, and using that old style Python way of documenting everything on your library. But as Dynaconf is more like a client, not really a library, you instantiate as a client, you are the end user, you are not really extending it a lot in terms of API. I learned that today, and I think it's something that is changing on software industry. If you look to the newest software that is created on open source, documentation is becoming more like a set of tutorials written in a book form. If you go to excellent documentations like FastAPI, I can mention, you see that the style of reading docs are more like a tutorial. You are guiding the person to known workflows on how to use your application instead of documenting every method or every single thing your application can do. You put everything together. So was an interesting thing I learned, a different way of writing docs. And I'm trying to do this, to apply this to Dynaconf. There's a lot of things we need to change there in this way. And this is more difficult because you can't just look to the code and document based on code. You need to think about use cases and document each use case separately, but it's more powerful in terms of documentation. An unexpected thing that I figured out is that Django settings is really difficult to customize. While in Flask, you can easily subclass and override a config class because it's like designed for that. On Django, the only way to customize the settings interface is by patching. Yeah, so I discussed it with some Django core developers, ways of making the Django settings, because Django has its settings manager when you do from django.conf import settings. it does similar things as Dynaconf, like lazy loading and things like this. You can add plugins to it. You can customize it in a good way. So what we did, we patched it. All the other libraries for Django are patching the settings, and we are constantly trying to get Django developers more involved in a way to make it easier. And the other thing was challenging, I think, is merging data from multiple sources. It's the biggest challenge right now, the source of our most of our bugs and requests and confusion is how do you take multiple data and merge conflicting data, and how to make the decision of the precedence, which one wins, and how the final data will look. So yeah, we are still learning and trying to improve better ways of giving flexibility for people that wants to merge data from different sources.
And so for an individual or a team who's looking for a way to manage settings for their application or their project, what are the cases where Dynaconf is the wrong choice and maybe they're better suited with a different framework or building their own custom solution?
Well, I like to think that Dynaconf is a good fit for any project that needs the couple settings from code. Yeah. So if your project doesn't need to decouple the settings from your code and you are good with just a constant.py file and everything static there, I think then maybe Dynaconf is not needed because you are adding the loading overhead and all the things, and you actually doesn't have the need. But I like to think that this is simple, small, and you can use it in any project, from a simple project having only a single settings.toml or .yaml file, from a project using multiple environments, thousands of files, and external services. However, if your project is a library or a plugin to be added to another project, I don't recommend you using Dynaconf. And I saw people trying to do this and coming to the issues saying that there were some kind of bug or problem. And actually, I think libraries or plugins doesn't have to define settings. Libraries and plugins will consume the settings from the application that are consuming it. So I think that would be the good choice. If you are doing a library or a plugin, you add interfaces that you can receive the settings from the application that you are plugging into. And Dynaconf will definitely not be a good solution. You're going to be like frustrated because Dynaconf depends on environment, and you don't control environment when you are releasing a library or a plugin.
And as you continue to build and maintain and evolve the Dynaconf project, you mentioned a little bit of the work that is kind of in process, but I'm wondering, what do you have planned for the near to medium term, or any areas of feedback or contribution that you're looking for help with?
Yeah, so first I would like to thank the contributors and co-maintainers of the project. We gather like amount of people that helps me like taking decisions and giving the project to the right direction. And we recently defined the roadmap for the version 4.0. And there are three big changes. We have small fixes, improvements, but the three biggest changes is we are implementing that new way to validate settings. This is based on Pydantic and Python type annotations. So we want to keep all the current way of doing things working without breaking any compatibility, but we are adding this new way for you to define schema in the Pydantic style that will work good. The second thing is we are splitting the code base and removing the core features and transforming in plugins. So the Dynaconf package, when you install Dynaconf, will keep being a bundle with all the parts installed together. So it's not going to break any installation. But then we are creating external projects on the organization that will be Dynaconf Core, Dynaconf Vault, Dynaconf Redis, Dynaconf YAML. So every single loader, every single functionality will be split into a separate repository. Not everything, but all the things that make sense to be separated. So those can evolve like plugins. And when deciding which feature you want, you can pull only the feature you need to build your settings library. So this is like a technical debt we had on the first implementation, and we are solving in the version 4.0. And I think the other one, which is the hardest one, and I'm working a lot on it, is the data merging algorithm. I said to you that data merging is the most difficult thing to do in a settings library. And Dynaconf today has a port written in Rust. If you go to crates.io, you have a project there called HydroConf. HydroConf is the same philosophy, the same strategies of Dynaconf written in Rust for Rust web applications. And when doing this in Rust, we found that the merging algorithm is more efficient in Rust. So what we're going to do is we're going to write this as a separate crate on the Rust and export that crate to a Python module, and then reuse this in Python, because it's something that today is really easy to do, to create a Python plugin, Python module in Rust. And then we're going to fix the problem of data merging to be really more efficient using Rust. So those are the three things that are on the roadmap for the version 4.0. And yeah, hopefully it comes this year, I hope.
Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you and follow along, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And so with that, I'll move us into the picks. This week, my pick is on the theme of secrets management for applications. So I've been using the SOPS project for a while for some of my work. It's a great utility for being able to encrypt data in flat files and do it in a manner that is relatively secure, because it's able to hook into things like either HashiCorp Vault or different cloud key management solutions, so that you can use their secret key material to be able to manage the encryption. So it's a bit safer to be able to actually store it in your source repositories and version your secrets along with your code. So definitely recommend taking a look at that for anybody who's interested. It's a project out of the Mozilla group. And so with that, I'll pass it to you, Bruno. Do you have any picks this week?
Yeah, so first, a note on your pick. I think it's interesting. I heard about it, never use it. I hope it becomes like a Dynaconf plugin in the future to use the SOPs, the encryption stuff. We are using currently a thing called Jose. I don't know how to mention it, but it also does some kind of encryption. And yeah, with our plugin system, probably we're going to have SOPs integrated with Dynaconf. And yeah, so now going to my picks. Well, I don't have a pick in terms of software, and as you said, it can be anything. So I recently watched a series very interested called Severance, and I think it's really great. I just finished it, and it's on my mind. I can't start thinking about what's happening there. So I recommend for people who like a little bit of sci-fi, but just a little bit, and also computers. This is really interesting. Yeah, so my other pick is going to be learn Rust. I think the future of Python is full of Rust. Yeah, we're going to see more and more Rust in the future for doing better Python projects. So it's going to be a skill for every Python person to learn a little bit of Rust. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time today to join me and share the work that you've been doing on the Dynaconf project. It's definitely a very interesting and full-featured framework, and settings management is an important capability for any application. So I appreciate all of the time and energy that you and the other maintainers and contributors of that project have put into it. So thank you again for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the invitation. It was very nice to participate, and yeah, have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out our other shows, the Data Engineering Podcast, which covers the latest on modern data management, and the Machine Learning Podcast, which helps you go from idea to production with machine learning. Visit the site at pythonpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. And if you learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts@pythonpodcast.com with your story. And to help other people find the show, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends and coworkers.